Long before the legions of Rome cast their shadow across the ancient world, in the mists and dense forests of Iron Age Celtic Europe, there walked figures of immense power and mystery, the Druids. Their existence, stretching back perhaps to the late Bronze Age, and certainly flourishing by the 4th century BCE, is primarily glimpsed through the eyes of their conquerors and rivals, leaving us with fragments of a story whispered across millennia. Imagine a time when the land itself was alive with spirits, where every grove, every river, every towering oak held a sacred presence. This was the world of the Celts, a mosaic of tribes spanning from Ireland to Anatolia. And at the heart of their spiritual and intellectual life were these enigmatic individuals. Our earliest, albeit brief, encounter with the Druids comes from Greek writers. Diogenes Laertius, in his 3rd century CE work, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, attributes a mention to the 4th century BCE historian Sotion of Alexandria, who supposedly noted that the Druids were among the barbarian philosophers, alongside the Chaldeans of Assyria and the Magi of Persia. This fleeting reference is significant, placing them in a venerable lineage of ancient wisdom keepers, even if viewed from a Hellenic perspective that often categorized non-Greek cultures as barbarian. It suggests that their reputation for profound knowledge had already reached the Mediterranean world centuries before Caesar's campaigns. Another early Greek writer, Posidonius, whose work from the 1st century BCE is largely lost, but quoted by later authors like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, provides a more detailed, though still external view. He describes them as philosophers, theologians, and judges, holding immense authority within Celtic society. The very word Druid itself is steeped in linguistic mystery and scholarly debate. The most widely accepted etymology links it to an old Celtic compound word, perhaps druidsi, meaning oak knower or one who knows the oak. The oak tree, with its deep roots and towering canopy, was a symbol of strength, longevity, and wisdom in many ancient cultures, and particularly revered by the Celts. It was often associated with sacred groves, places where rituals were performed away from human settlements, under the watchful gaze of ancient trees. This etymology paints a picture of individuals deeply connected to nature, drawing their wisdom from the very fabric of the earth. However, some scholars propose alternative derivations, suggesting connections to words meaning firm or strong, or even a Proto-Indo-European root related to seeing or knowing. This linguistic ambiguity only deepens the allure, allowing for a multifaceted understanding of their perceived role. Wise men, powerful seers, or perhaps both. Their societal role, as far as we can reconstruct from the sparse evidence, was incredibly broad and deeply interwoven with the fabric of Celtic life. They were not merely priests, though priestly duties certainly fell under their purview. They were also judges, mediating disputes and enforcing laws, often holding sway over kings and chieftains. They were teachers, guardians of oral traditions, instructing the youth in history, cosmology, and ethics. They were diviners, interpreting omens and prophecies, guiding their communities through uncertain times. And they were healers, possessing knowledge of medicinal plants and ancient remedies. In a world without written legal codes or formal universities, the Druids served as the intellectual and spiritual backbone of their societies, a living repository of knowledge and authority. Imagine the young initiates, perhaps chosen from noble families, spending years, even decades, in rigorous training. Caesar, our most extensive, though biased source, claims that their training could last up to 20 years, during which they memorized vast quantities of verse and lore. This oral tradition was paramount. They deliberate. Ely avoided committing their sacred knowledge to writing, not due to a lack of literacy, as some Celts did use Greek or Roman script for practical purposes, but perhaps to preserve the sanctity and exclusivity of their teachings, or to ensure that their wisdom remained fluid and adaptable, passed from mind to mind, heart to heart. This deliberate choice makes their historical reconstruction all the more challenging, forcing us to piece together their world from external observations and archaeological whispers. One of the most fascinating aspects of their spiritual practice, according to classical authors, was their reverence for nature. They worshipped in sacred groves, often referred to as nematons, rather than in man-made temples. These groves, often featuring ancient trees and natural springs, were considered liminal spaces, thresholds between the human and divine worlds. Here, beneath the rustling leaves and dappled sunlight, they would perform their rituals, perhaps offering sacrifices, divining the future, or communing with the spirits of the land. The mistletoe, a parasitic plant growing on oak trees, held particular significance. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, describes a ritual where Druids, clad in white robes, would ascend an oak tree to cut mistletoe with a golden sickle, catching it in a white cloth. This ritual, performed on the 6th day of the moon, was believed to imbue the mistletoe with potent healing and fertility properties. While Pliny's account is late and likely romanticized, it highlights the deep symbolic connection between the Druids, the oak, and the natural world. The question of human sacrifice is one of the most contentious and debated aspects of Druidic practice. Roman authors, particularly Caesar, depict the Druids as presiding over gruesome human sacrifices, often involving wicker men filled with victims set ablaze. These accounts, however, must be read with extreme caution. Roman propaganda often demonized the peoples they sought to conquer, portraying them as barbaric to justify their subjugation. While ritualistic violence and even human sacrifice were not unheard of in many ancient cultures, including Rome itself at various points, the scale and nature described by Caesar might be exaggerated. Archaeological evidence for widespread human sacrifice in Celtic lands is ambiguous and often open to multiple interpretations. Bog bodies, such as Tolland Man or Lindo Man, found in northern Europe, show signs of violent death and ritual deposition, but their connection to Druidic practices is difficult to definitively prove. It remains a scholarly dispute whether these accounts reflect a widespread practice or were isolated incidents, perhaps misinterpreted or deliberately sensationalized by Roman observers. Beyond their religious and judicial functions, the Druids also played a crucial role in maintaining cultural identity. In a world of shifting tribal alliances and frequent warfare, they provided a sense of continuity and shared heritage. They were the keepers of the collective memory, reciting epic tales of heroes and gods, ensuring that the past remained alive in the present. Their teachings likely emphasized a cyclical view of time, a belief in the transmigration of souls, and a profound connection between the living and the ancestral spirits. This worldview, so different from the linear progression of Roman thought, would have fostered a unique understanding of life, death, and the cosmos. Imagine a young Celtic warrior standing before a druid, seeking guidance before battle, perhaps gazing into the patterns of smoke from a sacred fire or interpreting the flight of birds, would offer counsel, drawing upon generations of accumulated wisdom. Their authority was not based on brute force, but on knowledge, spiritual insight, and an almost mystical connection to the unseen forces of the world. This made them formidable figures, capable of uniting tribes or, conversely, stirring them to resistance against foreign invaders. The geographical reach of the Druids is another intriguing puzzle. While most classical sources focus on Gaul, modern France, and Britain, their presence is also attested in Ireland, where they are often associated with the Fili, poets, and Brehons, judges, of early Irish society. The extent to which these insular Druids differed from their continental counterparts is a matter of ongoing discussion. Perhaps the isolation of Ireland allowed their traditions to evolve differently, or to persist longer, relatively untouched by Roman influence. The earliest Irish myths and legends, though written down centuries later by Christian monks, often contain echoes of a pre-Christian spiritual landscape, featuring wise figures who wielded magical powers and served as advisors to kings. The enigmatic nature of the Druids, shrouded in the mists of time and filtered through the lenses of their adversaries, continues to captivate us. We see them as figures on the cusp of history and myth, guardians of an ancient wisdom that largely vanished with the rise of new empires and new faiths. Their existence reminds us of a world where the sacred was intertwined with the mundane, where the whispers of the wind carried messages from the divine, and where certain individuals held the key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Their story is a testament to the enduring human quest for meaning, for connection to something larger than oneself, and for understanding the intricate dance between humanity and the natural world. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. Our journey now takes us deeper into the heart of the ancient Celtic world, beyond the stone circles and the whispers of the wind, to explore the very essence of what it meant to be a Druid, their beliefs, their understanding of the cosmos, and the practices that wove their spiritual tapestry. For the Druids, the world was not merely a collection of objects and phenomena, but a living, breathing entity, imbued with spirit and interconnectedness. Their worldview was fundamentally animistic, a profound reverence for nature that saw divinity in every rustling leaf, every flowing river, every towering tree. The sacred grove, often a clearing within an ancient forest, was not just a place of worship. It was the temple itself, its canopy the vaulted ceiling, its roots the foundations, its living inhabitants the congregation. This deep connection to the natural world was not a passive appreciation. It was an active, reciprocal relationship. The Druids believed that spirits inhabited trees, rocks, rivers, and springs, and that these spirits could be communicated with, honoured, and even appeased. The oak, in particular, held immense significance, its grandeur and longevity symbolising strength, wisdom, and a connection between the earthly and celestial realms. Mistletoe, growing upon the oak, was considered especially potent, a gift from the gods, gathered with reverence and ceremony. Pliny the Elder, a Roman natural philosopher writing in the 1st century CE, describes the Druidic ritual of gathering mistletoe with a golden sickle, a detail that, while perhaps embellished by Roman imagination, highlights the perceived sacredness of the plant and the meticulous nature of their rites. This reverence extended to all elements. Fire, water, earth, and air were not abstract concepts, but tangible manifestations of divine power. each with its own sacred properties and associated rituals. The cycle of the seasons, the ebb and flow of life and death in the natural world, was central to their spiritual understanding. They observed the solstices and equinoxes, the turning points of the year, as moments of profound energetic shift, marking them with ceremonies that mirrored the rhythms of the cosmos. Samhain, occurring around November the 1st, marked the end of summer and the harvest, and the beginning of the darker half of the year. It was a time when the veil between worlds was believed to thin, allowing spirits to cross over, a time for remembering ancestors and for divination. Imbolc, in early February, celebrated the stirrings of spring, the return of light, and the promise of new life. Beltane, in early May, heralded the arrival of summer, a time of fertility and growth, often marked by bonfires and rituals to protect livestock and crops. And Lughnasadh, in early August, was a harvest festival, a time of thanksgiving for the bounty of the earth. These festivals were not merely celebrations, they were intricate rituals designed to maintain harmony with the natural and spiritual worlds, to ensure the continued prosperity of their communities. Central to the Druidic belief system was the concept of reincarnation, or more accurately, metempsychosis, the transmigration of the soul. Julius Caesar, in his Commentari de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, states that the Druids taught that souls do not perish but pass after death from one body to another. This belief in an eternal soul constantly moving through different forms would have profoundly shaped their approach to life and death, fostering a sense of continuity and perhaps lessening the fear of mortality. It suggested that existence was a cyclical journey, not a linear path to an ultimate end. This understanding of the soul's journey also informed their cosmology, which likely viewed the universe as a series of interconnected realms, with the living world merely one stage in a much grander spiritual drama. The Druids were not just priests, they were also philosophers, judges, healers, and seers. Their knowledge encompassed a vast array of disciplines, passed down orally through generations of rigorous training. They understood the movements of the stars and planets, using this astronomical knowledge to predict celestial events and to guide their agricultural and ritual calendars. They possessed a deep understanding of herbal medicine, knowing which plants could heal and which could harm, and how to prepare them for maximum efficacy. Their legal expertise made them arbiters of disputes, their judgments respected and often binding. And their prophetic abilities, whether through interpreting omens, dreams, or natural phenomena, offered guidance and insight into the future. This multifaceted role meant that Druids were not simply religious figures, but integral pillars of Celtic society, holding immense influence and authority. One of the more enigmatic aspects of Druidic practice, and one that has fueled much historical debate, concerns the nature of their sacrifices. Roman authors, particularly Caesar, describe human sacrifices being performed by the Druids, often in gruesome detail, such as the Wicker Man ritual, where victims were burned alive. These accounts, however, must be viewed through a critical lens. Roman writers often sought to demonize the peoples they conquered, portraying them as barbaric to justify their own imperial expansion. While archaeological evidence does suggest that some Celtic societies engaged in ritual violence or sacrifice, the extent and frequency of human sacrifice by the Druids themselves remain a scholarly dispute. Some historians argue that Roman accounts were exaggerated or misinterpreted, perhaps conflating Druidic practices with those of other Celtic groups, or even fabricating details for propaganda purposes. Others point to bog bodies found in Celtic lands, showing signs of violent ritual death as potential evidence, though linking these directly to Druidic rites is challenging. It's a mystery that continues to invite careful consideration of both the historical record and archaeological findings, reminding us that our understanding of ancient cultures is often filtered through the perspectives of their conquerors. Beyond the more dramatic accounts, the everyday spiritual practices of the Celts, guided by the Druids, would have been deeply interwoven with their daily lives. Offerings to deities and spirits were common, often placed in sacred wells, rivers, or groves. These offerings might include valuable artifacts, food, or even simple tokens, given in exchange for blessings, protection, or guidance. The veneration of specific deities, often associated with natural features or tribal identities, was also prevalent. While we lack a comprehensive pantheon, archaeological finds and later Irish and Welsh myths suggest a rich tapestry of gods and goddesses, often embodying aspects of fertility, war, craftsmanship, or the underworld. The Druids would have been the intermediaries between the human and divine realms, leading rituals, interpreting divine will, and ensuring the proper balance was maintained. The power of oral tradition was paramount in Druidic society. Unlike the Romans or Greeks, the Druids did not commit their sacred knowledge to writing, at least not for public consumption. Caesar again notes this, stating that they believed it was unlawful to entrust their teachings to writing, and that writing diminished memory. Instead, their vast body of knowledge, laws, histories, genealogies, medical remedies, and spiritual doctrines, was memorized and passed down through generations of students. This rigorous system of oral transmission ensured the purity and secrecy of their teachings, but it also means that much of what we know about them comes from external, often biased, sources. Imagine the discipline required to commit such a vast amount of information to memory. The hours spent in quiet contemplation and recitation within the hushed groves, the intricate mnemonic devices employed to preserve every sacred word. This emphasis on memory also speaks to a culture that valued direct experience and personal instruction over written texts, a more immersive and perhaps intimate way of learning. The Druids also played a significant role in Celtic art and symbolism. The intricate knotwork, spiral designs, and zoomorphic patterns found on Celtic artifacts are not merely decorative. They are imbued with symbolic meaning, reflecting their worldview. The endless knots, for example, could symbolize the interconnectedness of all life, the eternal cycle of creation and destruction, or the journey of the soul. The spirals might represent growth, expansion, or the sun's journey across the sky. These symbols, often found on personal adornments, weapons, or religious objects, served as a constant reminder of the spiritual presence in the material world, a visual language understood and cherished by the Celtic peoples. Consider the role of divination, a practice deeply embedded in Druidic spiritual life. The Druids were sought out for their ability to interpret omens and predict the future, offering guidance on matters ranging from personal decisions to tribal warfare. This might involve observing the flight of birds, the patterns of smoke from a fire, the movements of animals, or even the interpretation of dreams. The practice of imbas forosnai, mentioned in early Irish texts, was a form of poetic inspiration and divination, where a seer would enter a trance-like state to receive visions or knowledge. While the exact methods remain somewhat obscure, it paints a picture of a spiritual leader deeply attuned to subtle signs and capable of accessing profound insights beyond ordinary perception. The Druids' role as educators was also crucial. They were the keepers of wisdom, responsible for the intellectual and spiritual development of the Celtic elite. Young men, and possibly women, would spend years, sometimes even decades, studying under a Druid master. This education was comprehensive, encompassing not only spiritual teachings, but also astronomy, philosophy, law, and rhetoric. It was a holistic education designed to shape well-rounded individuals capable of leading their communities. The rigorous training, the emphasis on memorization, and the deep immersion in their cultural and spiritual heritage ensured that the Druidic tradition was not merely preserved, but continually revitalized through new generations of learned individuals. As we reflect on the core beliefs and practices of the Druids, we begin to understand why they held such a powerful and enduring influence over the Celtic peoples. They were not just priests who performed rituals. They were the intellectual and spiritual backbone of their societies, the guardians of ancient wisdom and the interpreters of the divine. Their animistic worldview, their reverence for nature, their understanding of the soul's journey, and their multifaceted roles as teachers, judges, healers, and seers painted a picture of a complex and sophisticated spiritual system. Yet much of their inner world, their secret teachings, remains shrouded in the mists of time, accessible only through fragments and interpretations. The very nature of their oral tradition, while preserving their knowledge for their own people, created a barrier for later historians. We are left to piece together their spiritual landscape from the echoes of Roman accounts, the faint whispers of archaeology, and the later mythological traditions of Ireland and Wales, which, while rich, were often recorded centuries after the decline of classical Druidism and influenced by Christian perspectives. Perhaps these ancient groves, where they once gathered, still hold the silent echoes of their chants, their prayers, and their profound connection to the living spirit of the earth. We can only imagine the solemnity of their ceremonies, the deep reverence in their voices as they addressed the spirits of the trees, the rivers, and the sky. Their legacy is not just in the stone circles they may have helped to interpret, but in the enduring idea of a profound, respectful relationship between humanity and the natural world, a concept that continues to resonate even today. The whispers of the ancient forests carried more than just the rustling of leaves. They carried the echoes of knowledge, carefully preserved and passed down through generations. This was the domain of the Druids, the intellectual and spiritual backbone of Celtic society, whose training was as rigorous and demanding as any formal education known to the ancient world. It was a path not measured in years, but often in decades, a commitment that began in youth and shaped the entire trajectory of a life. Imagine a young acolyte, perhaps no older than 7 or 8, taken from their family and brought into the secluded groves and sacred spaces where Druidic instruction took place. There were no textbooks, no scrolls to pore over, for the Druids held a profound reverence for the spoken word, for memory, and for the living tradition. This was a deliberate choice, a safeguard against the corruption of written texts, a way to ensure that the knowledge remained vibrant and adaptable, passed from mind to mind, heart to heart. Julius Caesar, in his commentaries, noted with a mix of admiration and bewilderment that the Druids committed an immense number of verses to memory, sometimes requiring 20 years or more to complete their full course of study. This wasn't merely rote memorization, it was an immersive process of understanding, interpretation, and internalization. Their curriculum was vast, encompassing nearly every facet of natural and human existence. Astronomy was a cornerstone, not merely for charting the stars, but for understanding the rhythms of the cosmos and their influence on earthly life. They tracked the solstices and equinoxes with meticulous precision, marking the turning points of the year, which were deeply interwoven with their sacred festivals. The movements of the moon and stars informed their understanding of time, agriculture, and even prophecy. Imagine them under a canopy of ancient oaks, pointing out constellations, reciting complex calculations of celestial movements. Their voices low and resonant in the cool night air. Perhaps these early astronomers even used sophisticated stone circles, like those found across Britain and Ireland, not just as ceremonial sites, but as elaborate observatories, their alignments marking the rising and setting of key celestial bodies. Law was another pillar of Druidic learning. In a society without written statutes, the Druids served as judges, arbitrators, and keepers of customary law. They resolved disputes, pronounced judgments, and upheld the intricate social order. Their legal knowledge was not merely a collection of rules, but an understanding of justice, fairness, and the delicate balance required for community harmony. They understood the nuances of property rights, tribal alliances, and the unwritten codes of honor that governed Celtic life. A dispute brought before a Druid would be heard with careful attention, the wisdom of generations invoked to guide the decision. Their pronouncements carried immense weight, for they were seen as interpreters of divine will and ancestral custom. Medicine, too, fell under their purview. The Druids were skilled healers, drawing upon an extensive knowledge of herbs, plants, and natural remedies. They understood the properties of various flora, their uses in treating ailments, soothing pain, and promoting recovery. Their approach was holistic, recognizing the interconnectedness of body, mind, and spirit. They would gather specific plants at particular phases of the moon, believing that celestial influences enhanced their potency. Imagine a druid, with gentle hands and a deep understanding of the forest's bounty, preparing a poultice from crushed leaves or brewing a restorative tea from roots gathered at dawn. This practical knowledge was often intertwined with ritual and incantation, for they believed that healing also involved restoring balance to the spiritual realm. But perhaps the most celebrated of their skills was poetry. He bards, often considered a distinct but closely related class within the Druidic sphere, were the guardians of history, genealogy, and mythology. They composed and recited epic tales of heroes, gods, and ancestral deeds, their voices weaving tapestries of sound that captivated audiences around crackling fires. This wasn't just entertainment. It was how history was recorded, how cultural values were transmitted, and how the collective memory of the people was preserved. The intricate meters and rich imagery of Celtic poetry were themselves a form of intellectual discipline, requiring immense linguistic skill and creative power. A young bard might spend years perfecting their craft, learning thousands of verses, mastering the art of improvisation, and understanding the subtle power of words to inspire, to mourn, and to celebrate. The Druids also served as philosophers and theologians, delving into profound questions about the nature of the universe, the human soul, and the divine. They taught the transmigration of souls, a belief that after death, the soul would pass into another body, whether human or animal. This belief in reincarnation profoundly influenced their view of life and death, fostering a certain fearlessness in battle, as the ultimate end was not oblivion, but a journey to another existence. They spoke of an other world, a realm beyond the physical, where gods and ancestors resided, a place that could sometimes be glimpsed or even entered through sacred sites or during liminal times of the year. The training itself was conducted in secret, often in remote groves or secluded forest clearings, away from the prying eyes of outsiders. This exclusivity reinforced their authority and ensured the purity of their traditions. Students learned through observation, repetition, and direct instruction from their masters. They would spend countless hours listening, memorizing, and then reciting. Their understanding deepened through Socratic-style dialogues and practical application. The oral tradition was not merely a method of instruction, it was a philosophy, a way of being. It fostered incredible memory, sharp analytical skills, and a profound connection to the spoken word. This reliance on oral tradition is one of the reasons why so much about the Druids remains mysterious to us today. While they possessed a form of written script, likely ogham, primarily used for inscriptions and short messages, they deliberately chose not to commit their most sacred knowledge to writing. This decision has fueled much scholarly debate. Some historians argue it was a way to maintain power and exclusivity, ensuring that only the initiated had access to their profound wisdom. Others suggest it was a philosophical choice, believing that written words were static and dead, unable to capture the living, evolving nature of truth. Perhaps they feared that written texts could be misinterpreted, corrupted, or even fall into the wrong hands, leading to the misuse of sacred knowledge. The debate continues, leaving us to piece together their intricate world from the fragments left by Roman observers, archaeological discoveries, and later Celtic myths and legends. One lesser-known detail about their educational practices is the emphasis on riddles and poetic challenges. Young druids and bards would often engage in contests of wit and memory, not just for entertainment, but as a crucial part of their intellectual development. These challenges honed their linguistic skills, their ability to think on their feet, and their capacity to weave complex narratives and arguments. Imagine two young acolytes standing before their master, each trying to outdo the other with intricate verses or clever solutions to ancient conundrums, their minds sharp and agile. The Druids were not just religious figures, they were the intellectual elite, the philosophers, scientists, and legal minds of their time. Their influence permeated every level of Celtic society. From advising kings to mediating disputes between tribes, they were the keepers of history, the interpreters of omens, and the guardians of the sacred relationship between humanity and the natural world. Their long training ensured that those who held such immense power and responsibility were thoroughly versed in the traditions, ethics, and knowledge that underpinned their civilization. Their world was one steeped in observation and reverence for nature. They saw the divine in the rustling leaves of the sacred oak, in the flowing waters of a spring, in the soaring flight of an eagle. Their knowledge of the natural world was not just practical, but deeply spiritual, understanding the interconnectedness of all things. They were the bridge between the human and the divine, between the past and the future, between the seen and the unseen. As the Roman Empire expanded, bringing its own traditions of written law and codified knowledge, the Druidic oral tradition faced its greatest challenge. The Romans, accustomed to written records and centralized authority, often viewed the Druids with suspicion, seeing them as obstacles to their imperial ambitions. The very nature of Druidic knowledge, fluid and unwritten, made it difficult for the Romans to understand or control. This clash of cultures would ultimately contribute to the decline of the Druidic order. But for centuries, their system of education and oral tradition stood as a testament to the power of memory, the depth of human intellect, and the enduring strength of a culture that chose to carry its wisdom not on parchment, but in the hearts and minds of its most dedicated keepers. The legacy of their rigorous training, though largely unwritten, continues to resonate. It speaks to a time when knowledge was a living thing, passed down through the breath and voice, imbued with the wisdom of generations. It reminds us that education can take many forms, and that some of the most profound truths are found not in books, but in the deep, resonant echoes of an ancient, unbroken oral tradition. And perhaps as we drift into slumber, we can almost hear those echoes, the low murmur of Druidic instruction carried on the wind through the ancient forests. The mist-shrouded groves, alive with the rustle of leaves and the murmur of ancient incantations, were not merely places of worship for the Druids. They were also the very heart of Celtic governance. For in a society that valued wisdom and tradition above all else, the Druids were not just spiritual guides, but the architects of law, the arbiters of justice, and the silent, powerful advisors to kings and chieftains. Their influence permeated every layer of Celtic life. From the grand pronouncements of war and peace to the most intimate disputes between neighbours. Imagine a world without written legal codes, without sprawling courthouses or professional lawyers as we know them today. Instead, justice was woven into the fabric of the community, upheld by men and women whose memories were vast libraries of custom and precedent. These were the Druids. They sat in judgment, not from a high bench, but often beneath the spreading branches of a sacred oak, or within the hallowed circle of standing stones. Their authority was immense, stemming from their perceived connection to the divine, their profound knowledge, and their mastery of rhetoric. A Druid's word, carefully chosen and delivered with gravitas, carried the weight of generations of tradition and the unspoken threat of spiritual censure. The kings, though seemingly supreme, rarely acted without first consulting their Druids. These wise counselors were the keepers of the collective memory, the interpreters of omens, and the strategists who understood the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that defined Celtic society. Before a battle, a Druid might perform divinations, studying the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals to discern the will of the gods. Their pronouncements could sway the morale of an army, inspiring courage or instilling caution. During peace, they advised on matters of diplomacy, land distribution, and the delicate balance of power between tribes. The relationship was often symbiotic. The king provided military might and executive power, while the Druid offered legitimacy, spiritual guidance, and intellectual prowess. One of the most striking aspects of Druidic power was their role as judges. They presided over all manner of disputes, from property disagreements and inheritance claims to criminal offences. Their judgments were considered binding, and the consequences of defying them could be severe. The most potent weapon in a Druid's arsenal was excommunication, a social and spiritual exile that stripped an individual of all rights and protections. Imagine being cast out from your community, unable to participate in sacrifices, denied the comfort of fire and hearth, effectively becoming a ghost among the living. This was a fate more terrifying than death for many Celts, highlighting the profound social cohesion and spiritual dependency of their world. Caesar, in his commentaries, vividly describes this power, noting that those excommunicated were held in the number of the impious and criminal. All shun them and avoid their society and conversation, lest they receive some injury from their contact. This wasn't merely social ostracization, it was a spiritual death sentence, a complete severing from the communal soul. The laws themselves were not written down, but passed orally, memorized and meticulously preserved by generations of Druids. This oral tradition ensured that the laws remained flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, yet rigid enough to maintain consistency and order. It also underscored the Druids' unique position as the sole custodians of legal knowledge, further cementing their authority. They were, in essence, the living embodiment of the law, their minds the archives of centuries of precedent and custom. This reliance on oral tradition also presents a challenge for modern historians. While we know the Druids had a complex legal system, the details of their specific laws and judgments are largely lost to you, leaving much to scholarly interpretation and inference from archaeological finds and later Irish and Welsh legal texts that may contain echoes of earlier Druidic practices. Consider the role of the brehon in early Irish law, a figure whose functions bear a striking resemblance to the judicial Druid. The brehons were professional jurists who administered a sophisticated legal system based on ancient custom. While the term Druid had largely faded by the time these laws were formally written down, the continuity of an educated, respected class of legal experts suggests a direct lineage. These brehon laws, such as the Sensus Mor, detail intricate rules concerning property, contracts, injuries, and even the rights of animals. They reveal a society deeply concerned with social order, restitution, and the careful balancing of individual and communal rights. It's not unreasonable to imagine the Druids of earlier centuries applying similar principles, their judgments shaping the very fabric of Celtic society. The Druids also played a crucial role in maintaining intertribal peace. When disputes arose between different Celtic groups, it was often a neutral Druid, respected by all parties, who would mediate. Their authority transcended tribal boundaries, making them ideal arbitrators in a world often prone to conflict. They could negotiate treaties, enforce truces, and even declare certain areas or times as sacred and inviolable, thus creating zones of peace. This overarching influence suggests a degree of pan-Celtic unity, at least in matters of law and religion, orchestrated and maintained by the Druidic order. Beyond their judicial and advisory roles, Druids were also educators. They trained new generations of Druids, imparting not only spiritual wisdom and legal knowledge, but also skills in astronomy, natural philosophy, and poetry. This extensive education, which could last for 20 years, ensured a continuous supply of highly intelligent and well-versed individuals to fill the crucial roles within society. The very act of memorizing vast amounts of laws and verses honed their minds, making them formidable debaters and persuasive speakers. This intellectual rigor further enhanced their prestige and solidified their position as the intellectual elite of Celtic society. Historians still debate the precise extent of Druidic political power. Were they truly the ultimate authority, with kings serving merely as their enforcers, or were they powerful advisors who could be overruled by a strong-willed chieftain? Caesar's accounts, while valuable, are often viewed through the lens of a Roman conqueror seeking to understand and ultimately subdue a foreign people. He emphasizes their power, perhaps to highlight the formidable nature of the enemy he faced. However, other classical sources and the internal evidence from later Celtic texts suggest a more nuanced relationship. It was likely a delicate balance, with the relative power shifting depending on the individual personalities of the king and the druid, and the specific circumstances of the time. A charismatic and wise druid could undoubtedly wield immense influence, guiding a king with subtle counsel and spiritual authority. A weak or unpopular druid, however, might find their advice disregarded. Consider the story of Cathbad, a powerful druid in the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology. He's depicted as a seer, a prophet, and a counsellor to King Conquest mac Nessa. Cathbad's prophecies often shape the destinies of heroes, and his wisdom is sought in times of crisis. While mythical, such figures often reflect societal ideals and the perceived roles of real individuals. Cathbad's portrayal suggests a druid who was not just an advisor, but a figure whose pronouncements carried significant weight, capable of influencing royal decisions and even foretelling the future. This blending of spiritual insight with political foresight is a recurring theme. The Druids' poly. Political influence also extended to matters of war and peace. Before a major conflict, they would often perform rituals and offer sacrifices, seeking divine favor and interpreting omens. Their pronouncements could determine whether a battle was fought or avoided. They might also accompany warriors into battle, not as fighters, but as spiritual protectors, offering blessings and maintaining morale. Their presence on the battlefield would have been a powerful psychological factor, inspiring their own side and perhaps unsettling their enemies, who would fear the Druids' magical abilities. The decline of Druidic political power began with the Roman conquest of Gaul. The Romans, with their centralized legal system and imperial authority, saw the Druids as a threat to their control. They systematically suppressed the Druidic order, forbidding their practices and destroying their sacred groves. For the Romans, the Druids represented a powerful, independent authority that could incite resistance and maintain a distinct Celtic identity. By dismantling the Druidic judicial and political structures, Rome aimed to integrate the Celtic peoples more fully into their empire. This suppression was a gradual process, but it effectively broke the backbone of Druidic political influence in Gaul by the 1st century CE. In Britain and Ireland, however, the Druids continued to flourish for a longer period, untouched by Roman legions for centuries. Even in these lands, their power eventually waned, though the reasons are more complex. The rise of Christianity, with its own structured clergy and legal traditions, gradually eroded the Druids' spiritual and judicial monopoly. Christian monks meticulously recorded laws and histories, tasks that had once been the sole purview of the Druids. While some aspects of Druidic wisdom and legal custom may have been absorbed into early Christian Celtic society, the distinct political and judicial role of the Druid faded, replaced by new forms of authority. Yet the echoes of their influence lingered. The reverence for custom, the emphasis on oral tradition, and the deep respect for wisdom and learning continued to characterize Celtic societies long after the last Druid had passed into legend. The very concept of a wise counselor, a legal expert, and a spiritual guide, deeply embedded in the Celtic psyche, perhaps owes its enduring presence to the profound legacy of the Druids. They were not merely priests. They were the guardians of order, the architects of justice, and the silent, powerful force that that shaped the destinies of kings and commoners alike, in a world where the sacred and the secular were inextricably intertwined. Their judgments, delivered beneath the ancient trees, were the very bedrock upon which Celtic society was built, a testament to the enduring power of wisdom and tradition. The soft mists that once veiled the sacred groves, nurturing the quiet wisdom of the Druids, began to stir with an unfamiliar wind, a wind carrying the scent of iron, the distant clang of disciplined legions, and the stern, unyielding will of Rome. For centuries, the Celtic world had largely existed beyond the direct gaze of the Mediterranean empires, its intricate tapestry of tribes and traditions weaving itself across the vastness of Western Europe. But as the Roman Republic morphed into an empire, its insatiable appetite for order, resources, and strategic dominance turned its gaze northward and westward, towards the lands where Druidic influence held sway. The first significant tremors of this impending clash were felt in Gaul, modern-day France, during the mid-1st century BCE. Julius Caesar, a name that would forever be etched in the annals of history, embarked on his ambitious conquest of Gaul, a campaign that lasted from approximately 58 to 50 BCE. It was here that Roman perception of the Druids began to solidify, largely shaped by Caesar's own writings, particularly his Commentari de Bello Gallico, commentaries on the Gallic War. Caesar, a shrewd military commander and an even shrewder propagandist, presented the Druids as a powerful, organized priestly class, holding immense authority over the Gallic tribes. He described them as judges, educators, and religious leaders, mediating disputes, performing sacrifices, and teaching a complex philosophy that included beliefs in the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. Yet beneath this seemingly objective observation lay a strategic imperative. For Caesar, the Druids were not merely spiritual guides, they were also political instigators, fostering resistance against Roman expansion, rallying tribes, and preserving a distinct cultural identity that stood in direct opposition to Romanization. He noted their ability to unite disparate tribes under a common religious banner, a unity that presented a formidable challenge to his divide-and-conquer tactics. The very reverence accorded to the Druids by their people became in Roman eyes a dangerous source of rebellion. Caesar's accounts, while invaluable, must be read with a critical eye, understanding that they served a specific purpose: to justify his brutal campaigns and portray Roman dominance as a necessary civilizing force. He highlighted aspects of Druidic practice that would shock Roman sensibilities, such as human sacrifice, though the extent and nature of these practices remain a subject of scholarly debate. While archaeological evidence suggests that ritualistic killings did occur in some Celtic societies, often in specific contexts like bog bodies or dedications, Caesar's descriptions may have been amplified to paint the Druids as barbaric and thus deserving of suppression. The Roman approach to conquered peoples was often pragmatic. Integrate them into the imperial system, allow local customs to persist as long as they didn't threaten Roman authority, and offer the benefits of Roman citizenship and infrastructure. However, the Druids, with their deep-rooted influence and perceived anti-Roman stance, were seen as an exception. Their secretive nature, their oral traditions, and their resistance to adopting Roman gods or legal systems made them a particularly difficult element to assimilate. Roman policy therefore shifted from mere integration to active suppression when it came to the Druids. As Roman legions pushed further, the clash became more direct and often brutal. The conquest of Britain, initiated by Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, brought the Romans face to face with the heartland of Druidic power. It was here, in the wilder, less Romanized regions, that Druidic traditions were believed to be most vibrant and uncorrupted. The island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey off the coast of Wales, became a focal point of this confrontation. Roman writers like Tacitus, in his Annals, vividly describe the scene, Druidry, in the Roman assault on Mona in 60 or 61 CE, led by Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. Tacitus paints a dramatic picture. On the shore, a dense array of armed warriors stood, interspersed with women dressed in funereal black, their hair dishevelled, brandishing torches like furies. Among them, the Druids, with their hands raised to the heavens, uttered dire imprecations, cursing the Roman invaders. This spectacle, Tacitus recounts, initially struck fear into the hearts of the Roman soldiers, who stood transfixed, as if paralyzed by the sheer terror of the unknown and the supernatural. But Suetonius Paulinus, a seasoned commander, rallied his troops, urging them not to be intimidated by a fanatical host. The legions surged forward, cutting down the resistance, and then turned their fury upon the sacred groves. Tacitus describes the Romans felling the trees consecrated to savage superstitions, and extinguishing the altars drenched with the blood of human victims. This account, while undoubtedly dramatic and intended to highlight Roman bravery in the face of barbaric rites, offers a rare glimpse into the Roman perception of Druidic resistance. Mona was seen as a major sanctuary, a stronghold where Druidic learning and influence flourished, and its subjugation was a strategic priority to break the back of British resistance. The destruction of the groves and altars was not merely a military act, it was a symbolic act of desacralization, an attempt to dismantle the spiritual and cultural foundations of Celtic identity. The Roman campaigns against the Druids were not always overt military assaults. They also involved a more insidious form of suppression, cultural assimilation and legal prescription. Roman law, with its emphasis on written statutes and state-sanctioned religion, found the secretive, oral traditions of the Druids inherently threatening. Emperors like Tiberius and Claudius issued decrees forbidding Druidic practices, particularly those involving human sacrifice, which was anathema to Roman legal and ethical codes, even though the Romans themselves were not above extreme brutality in war. The suppression was gradual but relentless. As Roman control solidified, the public practice of Druidism became increasingly difficult. The construction of Roman towns, the introduction of Roman legal systems, and the establishment of state-sponsored cults, including the worship of the emperor, slowly eroded the traditional authority of the Druids. Temples to Roman gods or syncretic deities began to appear, often replacing or overshadowing older Celtic shrines. The Roman policy was not necessarily to exterminate every single Druid, but rather to dismantle their power structure, to discredit their authority, and to integrate the Celtic peoples into the broader Roman cultural and political sphere. Yet the complete eradication of Druidic influence proved to be an elusive goal. While the public, organized aspect of Druidism certainly waned under Roman pressure, it is likely that many of its beliefs and practices retreated into more private, localized forms. The reverence for sacred springs, trees, and natural sites, for instance, often persisted, sometimes even merging with Roman or later Christian traditions. The Druids' deep connection to the land, their understanding of herbal medicine, and their role as keepers of law may have continued in more subtle ways, passed down through families or small communities, far from the watchful eyes of Roman administrators. Historians still debate the extent of Roman success in completely stamping out Druidism. Some argue that the Roman suppression was so thorough that by the 2nd century CE, Druidism as a distinct, organized priesthood had largely ceased to exist. Others contend that its influence simply went underground, adapting and transforming, its essence surviving in folk traditions, local religious practices, and perhaps even influencing the early development of Christianity in Celtic lands. The lack of indigenous written records from the Druids themselves makes it difficult to definitively trace their fate, leaving much to scholarly interpretation and archaeological inference. One lesser-known detail, but highlights the Roman perception of Druidic power, comes from Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE. He mentions the Druids' reverence for mistletoe, especially when found growing on oak trees, and their elaborate ritual for harvesting it with a golden sickle. Pliny, though somewhat dismissive of what he considered magic, nevertheless acknowledges the Druids' reputation as skilled healers and herbalists, even attributing to them the belief that mistletoe could cure infertility and act as an antidote to poisons. This detail, while seemingly benign, underscores the Roman fascination and occasional grudging respect for Druidic knowledge, even as they sought to suppress its broader influence. It also suggests that not all Druidic practices were seen as equally threatening. Practical knowledge, like medicine, might have been tolerated or even absorbed, while political and religious leadership was actively targeted. The Roman conquest, therefore, was not merely a military occupation. It was a profound cultural encounter that irrevocably altered the landscape of Celtic Europe. The systematic dismantling of Druidic authority was a key component of Romanization, aimed at replacing indigenous spiritual and legal systems with Roman ones. The vibrant, independent world of the Druids, with its complex oral traditions and deep connection to the natural world, was forced to confront an empire built on written law, military might, and an insatiable drive for uniformity. The echoes of this clash resonated for centuries. The memory of the Druids, as both revered sages and rebellious instigators, continued to shape perceptions of Celtic identity. In the wake of Roman withdrawal and the subsequent rise of Christianity, the remnants of Druidic belief and practice would either fade into obscurity, transform, or be reinterpreted through new religious lenses. But the image of the Druid, standing defiant against the Roman legions on the shores of Mona, hands raised in an ancient curse, remains a powerful symbol of a spiritual world confronting an empire's relentless march. The silence that descended upon the sacred groves after the Roman axes had done their work was not an absolute silence, but a hushed quiet, a whisper of ancient traditions retreating into the shadows, waiting for a time when they might again emerge, perhaps in new forms, to speak to the soul of the land. The whisper of the wind through the ancient oaks, once a chorus of sacred pronouncements, began to carry a different sound, the distant, rhythmic march of Roman legions. As the eagles of Rome stretched their wings across Gaul and Britannia, they brought with them not only roads and aqueducts, but also an unwavering determination to reshape the spiritual landscape of the lands they conquered. For the Romans, the Druids, with their enigmatic rituals and their fierce independence, represented a formidable obstacle to their imperial ambitions. The Roman worldview, while often accommodating of local deities, found the Druidic system deeply unsettling. It was not simply a matter of differing gods. It was the Druids' unique social and political influence, their role as judges, teachers, and spiritual leaders that truly threatened Roman authority. Their councils could rally tribes, their pronouncements could ignite rebellions, and their very existence challenged the centralized power Rome sought to impose. The Druids were not merely priests, they were the living embodiment of a culture resistant to assimilation. The initial Roman encounters with the Druids were marked by a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Early Roman writers, like Julius Caesar, provided some of the most detailed, albeit biased, accounts of Druidic practices. Caesar, in his Commentari de Bello Gallico, circa 50 BCE, described them as powerful figures, responsible for public and private sacrifices, interpreting religious law and settling disputes. He noted their extensive knowledge of natural philosophy, astronomy, and theology, and their belief in the transmigration of souls. Yet even as he documented their intellectual prowess, Caesar also emphasized their alleged practice of human sacrifice, a detail that would later be heavily exploited by Roman propagandists to demonize and justify their suppression. It's worth noting that while archaeological evidence suggests some form of ritualistic violence in ancient Celtic societies, the extent and nature of human sacrifice, as depicted by Caesar, remains a point of scholarly debate, with many historians suggesting it was exaggerated to portray the Gauls as barbaric and thus legitimize Roman conquest. The true campaign against Druidism began not with a single decree, but with a series of escalating measures, reflecting Rome's gradual consolidation of power. Under the Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, the first overt steps were taken. Augustus, a shrewd politician who understood the power of religion in maintaining social order, sought to integrate conquered peoples into the Roman state through the adoption of Roman cults and the worship of the emperor. Druidism, with its strong local identity and its inherent resistance to foreign gods, stood in direct opposition to this policy. While Augustus did not issue an outright ban, he forbade Roman citizens from participating in Druidic rites, a subtle but significant move designed to undermine their prestige and influence among the elite. The true hammer blow fell during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor, who ruled from 14 CE to 37 CE. Tiberius, known for his stern and uncompromising nature, openly suppressed Druidism. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, explicitly states that the Druids have been banished by Tiberius Caesar. This was not merely a prohibition on Roman citizens, but a direct attempt to dismantle the Druidic order across the Roman provinces. Sacred groves, once hallowed sanctuaries where rituals were performed and wisdom imparted, were systematically cut down. Stone circles, which had stood for millennia as silent witnesses to ancient rites, were defaced or repurposed. The very trees that had been revered as living embodiments of the divine were felled, their wood used for Roman construction, or simply burned, a symbolic act of desacralization, the destruction of these sacred s. It was a profoundly traumatic experience for the indigenous populations. Imagine the quiet reverence of a community gathering within a sun-dappled grove, the air thick with the scent of oak and moss, the rustle of leaves a whispered prayer. Then picture the arrival of Roman soldiers, their axes gleaming, their shouts echoing through the once sacred space, felling ancient trees with brutal efficiency. These acts were not just about clearing land. They were about severing the spiritual connection between a people and their ancestral landscape, about erasing the physical manifestations of their faith. The persecution of Druid practitioners themselves was equally ruthless. While direct, widespread executions are not extensively documented in the same way as, say, Christian martyrs, the pressure was immense. Druids, as influential figures, would have been targeted by Roman authorities seeking to break the spirit of resistance. They would have faced arrest, interrogation, and likely execution or enslavement, particularly if they were perceived as instigators of rebellion. The Roman policy was clear: eliminate the leadership, dismantle the institutions, and absorb the populace into the Roman way of life. The island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey in Wales, provides a stark illustration of this brutal suppression. In 61 CE, the Roman governor of Britannia, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, launched a full-scale assault on Mona, which was considered a major stronghold of Druidic power and a refuge for rebels. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, vividly describes the scene. As the Roman legions advanced, they were met on the shore by a terrifying spectacle: a dense array of armed warriors, with women flitting among them, dressed in black with dishevelled hair like furies, brandishing torches. All around stood the Druids, lifting up their hands to heaven and pouring forth dreadful imprecations. This image, though undoubtedly coloured by Roman prejudice, speaks to the immense spiritual authority the Druids commanded. The Roman soldiers, initially unnerved by this otherworldly display, were urged on by their commander and eventually overcame the defenders. Tacitus recounts the brutal aftermath. The groves, devoted to Mona's barbarous superstitions, were then cut down, for it was their religion to drench their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities by means of human entrails. Again, the emphasis on human sacrifice serves to justify the Roman actions. Regardless of the veracity of these claims, the outcome was undeniable. Mona, a bastion of Druidism, was utterly devastated. Its sacred groves were razed, and its Druids slaughtered or scattered. This event marked a significant turning point, effectively breaking the organised power of Druidism in Britannia. While the Roman suppression was undeniably effective in dismantling the public and institutional aspects of Druidism, it's important to acknowledge the resilience of belief. It is unlikely that the faith simply vanished overnight. Instead, it likely retreated, becoming a more private, localized practice, perhaps merging with or influencing local folk traditions that continued to thrive away from the watchful eyes of Roman authorities. The Druidic legacy, though no longer openly proclaimed, may have persisted in the quiet wisdom passed down through generations, in the reverence for particular trees or springs, or in the subtle ways people continued to interact with the natural world. The decline of Druidism was also influenced by factors beyond direct Roman persecution. As Roman culture permeated Gaul and Britannia, the allure of Roman citizenship, trade, and infrastructure would have gradually eroded the traditional social structures that supported the Druidic order. Roman schools and legal systems offered alternative paths for education and justice, diminishing the Druids' unique roles. The adoption of Roman gods, often syncretized with local deities, contributed to a gradual shift in religious practices. It was a slow, inexorable tide, augmented by the violent storms of Roman conquest. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, explicit references to Druids in historical records become increasingly scarce. Their public role had largely vanished, their schools dispersed, and their sacred sites desecrated. The once powerful order, which had shaped the spiritual and intellectual life of Celtic societies for centuries, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, its influence largely confined to the realm of memory and fragmented tradition. Yet even in its decline, the image of the Druid continued to exert a powerful hold on the Roman imagination. They were often depicted as wise, mystical figures, sometimes as formidable enemies, at other times as sources of ancient knowledge. This enduring fascination hints at the profound impact they had made, even on those who sought to destroy them. The very act of suppression, the need to actively dismantle their system, speaks volumes about the perceived threat they posed and the deep roots they had in Celtic society. Historians still debate the precise timeline and extent of Druidic survival. Some argue that elements of Druidism persisted in remote areas, particularly in Ireland, which was never conquered by Rome, allowing a more continuous tradition to evolve. Others suggest that the Roman suppression was so thorough that any surviving elements were largely absorbed into later Christian traditions or folk beliefs, losing their distinct Druidic identity. The lack of indigenous written records from the Druids themselves makes it incredibly challenging to reconstruct their post-Roman fate with certainty. We are largely reliant on the accounts of their conquerors, which, while valuable, are inherently biased and incomplete. The story of the Roman suppression of Druidism is a poignant reminder of the fragility of cultural heritage in the face of imperial expansion. It illustrates how dominant powers often seek to dismantle the spiritual and intellectual foundations of conquered peoples as a means of control. The systematic destruction of sacred sites, the persecution of religious leaders, and the imposition of new cultural norms were all powerful tools in Rome's arsenal. Yet, even as the ancient groves fell silent and the voices of the Druids faded from public discourse, the spirit of the land, the deep connection to nature, and the echoes of ancient wisdom likely lingered. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, stories of a time when the oaks were sacred and the Druids were their guardians, their knowledge a living current flowing through the heart of the Celtic world. The memory, though obscured by time and conquest, would eventually resurface, inspiring later generations to rediscover and reimagine the enigmatic figures who once held such profound sway over the spiritual life of ancient Europe. The Roman legions may have silenced the public voice of the Druids, but they could not entirely erase the deep imprint they had left on the soul of the land and its people. The Roman legions, once the unyielding iron fist of empire, had begun their slow, deliberate retreat from Britannia by the early 5th century. Their departure was not a sudden exodus, but a gradual unravelling, a pulling back of threads from a tapestry woven over centuries. The last official Roman forces are thought to have left around 410 CE, a date often cited as the end of Roman rule in Britain. This left the Celtic peoples, who had lived under the Roman boot for so long, in a peculiar and precarious position. The familiar structures of Roman administration, its roads, its towns, its very language of governance, began to crumble or transform. In this shifting landscape, the echoes of Druidic thought, long suppressed and driven underground, found new, subtle ways to persist and intertwine with the burgeoning force of early Christianity. The vacuum left by Rome's withdrawal was not an empty space, but a fertile ground for new identities and beliefs to take root or re-emerge. The Roman policy of suppressing Druidism had been thorough, but not entirely successful. While the public rituals and organized priesthoods had largely vanished, the underlying spiritual connection to the land, the reverence for sacred groves and waters, the wisdom passed down through generations, these were not easily eradicated. They became part of the very fabric of Celtic folk belief, an undercurrent that flowed beneath the surface of Romanization and later Christianization. Consider the early Christian missionaries who arrived in these lands, often from Ireland or the continent. They encountered a people deeply connected to their environment, who saw divinity in trees, rivers, and stones. Rather than outright condemning these beliefs, many early Christian saints and evangelists adopted a strategy of assimilation, a process often termed syncretism. They understood that to gain converts, they needed to speak a language that resonated with the existing spiritual landscape. Thus, pagan holy sites were often rededicated as Christian churches. Sacred wells, once venerated for their healing powers and connection to ancient deities, became associated with Christian saints. The veneration of trees, a cornerstone of Druidic practice, subtly shifted into the planting of holy trees or the association of certain saints with specific arboreal species. This wasn't a deliberate conspiracy to preserve Druidism, but a pragmatic approach to conversion that inadvertently allowed older beliefs to endure, albeit in a new guise. One fascinating example of this is the figure of Saint Brigid of Kildare, a 5th century Irish abbess whose life and legends bear striking resemblances to the pre-Christian goddess Brigid. Both figures are associated with fire, poetry, healing, and craftsmanship. The perpetual flame maintained by Brigid's nuns at Kildare, which burned for centuries, mirrors the eternal fires believed to have been tended by druidesses or priestesses of the goddess. While Christian narratives portray Brigid as a devout follower of Christ, the layers of her story suggest a powerful continuity with older traditions, a bridging of the pagan and Christian worlds. Historians still debate the extent to which Saint Brigid's cult was a conscious absorption of the goddess Brigid, or if the similarities are purely coincidental, but the resonance is undeniable. It speaks to a time when new faiths were woven into existing spiritual tapestries rather than simply replacing them. The concept of the thin places, locations where the veil between worlds feels particularly permeable, is another echo. For the Druids, these were often natural sites, ancient stone circles, mist-shrouded hills, or deep forests. For early Christians, these places might become sites of monastic settlements or hermitages, still imbued with a sense of sacred power, but now recontextualized within a Christian framework. The reverence for hermits living in wilderness, close to nature, might subtly reflect an older respect for those who sought spiritual wisdom in the wild, much like the Druids. The legal systems that emerged in post-Roman Celtic societies also reveal interesting traces. While Roman law had left its mark, the Brehon laws of Ireland, for instance, compiled in the 7th and 8th centuries, show a sophisticated legal tradition that predates significant Christian influence and contains elements that some scholars argue reflect Druidic principles. These laws placed a strong emphasis on oral tradition, on the importance of reputation and honor, and on a deep understanding of natural cycles and agricultural life. The role of the fili, or poet seer, in early Irish society, who held immense prestige and often served as legal advisors, genealogists, and satirists, bears a striking resemblance to the multifaceted role of the Druid. While the Fili were not priests, their mastery of knowledge, their ability to speak truth to power, and their connection to ancestral wisdom placed them in a position of authority that echoed the Druidic past. The very landscape itself held memory. The megalithic monuments, the standing stones, the burial mounds. These were not merely inert rocks, but imbued with meaning, sacred spaces that linked the living to the ancestors and the spiritual realm. Even as Christian churches were built, these older sites continued to hold significance, sometimes becoming places of pilgrimage, sometimes simply respected as ancient markers of power. The Christianization of these sites often involved placing crosses upon them or associating them with saints, a way of baptizing the landscape and integrating it into the new religious order. The stories and myths, too, carried these echoes. The rich tapestry of Celtic mythology, with its heroic cycles, its tales of otherworldly beings, its deep connection to nature and the supernatural, continued to be told and retold. While Christian scribes often adapted these tales, sometimes demonizing pagan deities or reinterpreting events through a Christian lens, the core narratives and archetypes persisted. The concept of the otherworld, a realm distinct from, but intertwined with the mortal world, remained a powerful motif, echoing the Druidic belief in a complex cosmology. The Imrama, or voyage tales, where heroes journey to mystical islands, could be seen as a Christianized version of older spiritual quests, perhaps once undertaken under Druidic guidance. Consider the reverence for trees. The oak, in particular, held immense significance for the Druids. Its strength, longevity, and association with lightning made it a symbol of power and divinity. While the overt worship of trees was discouraged by Christianity, the deep respect for ancient trees, the belief in their wisdom, and the practice of tying rags to wishing trees or clooty wells in parts of Celtic lands are persistent folk traditions that carry the faint scent of Druidic reverence. These are not direct Druidic practices, but their roots can be traced to a worldview where the natural world was alive with spirit. The subtle influence extended even to the calendar. While the Christian calendar introduced new feast days, many of them were strategically placed to coincide with older pagan festivals. Samhain, the Celtic New Year, a time when the veil between worlds was thinnest, became All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. Imbolc, a festival celebrating the coming of spring, was associated with St. Brigid's Day. Beltane, a celebration of fertility and the height of spring, eventually morphed into May Day celebrations. These appropriations weren't always about erasing the old, but about transforming it, allowing a degree of continuity that made the transition to Christianity smoother for the populace. The very concept of a holy man or wise woman in Celtic society, figures who possessed knowledge of herbs, healing, and spiritual guidance, also carried a faint resonance of the Druidic past. While these individuals might have been Christian, their roles often encompassed aspects that would have been familiar to someone living in pre-Christian times. They were community healers, counselors, and interpreters of the spiritual world, much like the Druids had been. The transition was not a clean break, but a gradual blending, a reinterpretation of roles and beliefs within a new religious framework. The post-Roman Celtic world, therefore, was not a blank slate upon which Christianity was entirely new. It was a landscape rich with ancient spiritual memory, a memory that, though suppressed, continued to whisper from the stones, the trees, and the very air. The early Christianization of these lands was a complex process of negotiation, adaptation, and sometimes subtle absorption. The Druidic legacy, while no longer a visible, organized force, became part of the spiritual bedrock, influencing the shape and character of Celtic Christianity in ways that are still discernible today. The decline of Druidism as an organized priesthood was a direct consequence of Roman policy and the subsequent rise of Christianity. Yet its essence, its deep connection to nature, its emphasis on wisdom and oral tradition, its understanding of cyclical time did not simply vanish. It transformed, becoming part of the rich tapestry of Celtic folk belief, influencing the art, literature, and spiritual practices of the emerging Christian kingdoms. The shadows of the sacred groves, once the exclusive domain of the Druids, stretched into the Christian era, softening the edges of the new faith and imbuing it with a unique, deeply rooted spirituality. The Druids, in their disappearance, left an indelible mark, a quiet persistence that shaped the very soul of the Celtic world. The shadows of the medieval era, long and deep, began to recede with the dawn of the Renaissance, a period that rekindled a vibrant curiosity about the classical world and, in its wake, sparked a renewed interest in the ancient inhabitants of Britain and Gaul. As scholars pored over rediscovered texts, the scattered references to the Druids, once dismissed or demonized by Christian chroniclers, now began to stir a different kind of fascination. They were no longer merely pagan priests to be condemned, but figures shrouded in an exotic, almost mystical antiquity. This nascent curiosity blossomed more fully during the Enlightenment, a time characterized by a fervent pursuit of reason, empirical observation, and a certain romanticization of the noble savage and primeval wisdom. The Druids, as depicted by classical authors like Caesar and Pliny, seem to embody a form of ancient philosophy, a natural religion untainted by the perceived corruptions of organized faith. Intellectuals across Europe, weary of religious strife and the rigid doctrines of the Church, found in the Druids a compelling, albeit largely imagined, alternative. They were seen as philosopher priests, guardians of ancient knowledge, their groves transformed in the mind's eye into academies of natural science and moral philosophy. One of the most influential figures in this revival was William Stukeley, an 18th century English antiquarian and Anglican clergyman. Stukeley, an ardent admirer of ancient monuments, dedicated much of his life to surveying and interpreting sites like Stonehenge and Avebury. He was among the first to systematically study these megalithic structures, and in his eagerness to connect them to a known ancient culture, he attributed their construction to the Druids. In his seminal works, Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids, 1730, and Avebury, a temple of the British Druids, 1743, Stukeley presented a detailed, though highly speculative vision of Druidic society. He believed the Druids were not only the builders of these monumental temples, but also practitioners of a sophisticated monotheistic religion, akin to an early form of Christianity. He even went so far as to suggest that they were patriarchs of an ancient British church, preserving a pure, uncorrupted faith. Stukeley's theories, though now largely discredited by modern archaeology, were immensely popular in their time. They provided a powerful narrative that connected the awe-inspiring ruins of prehistoric Britain to a venerable, intellectual priesthood. His detailed engravings and vivid descriptions captured the public imagination, solidifying the image of the Druid as a robed, white-bearded sage, performing solemn rituals amidst the colossal stones of Stonehenge. This image, born of Stukeley's enthusiastic interpretation, would endure for centuries, shaping popular perceptions of the Druids far more than the sparse classical accounts. The Enlightenment's fascination with the Druids also intersected with a growing sense of national identity, particularly in Britain. As the British Empire expanded, there was a desire to establish a deep, ancient lineage for the nation, one that could rival the classical traditions of Greece and Rome. The Druids, as the indigenous intellectual elite of ancient Britain, offered a compelling answer. They became symbols of an ancient British wisdom, a testament to the island's unique and venerable heritage. This romanticized view of the Druids contributed to a broader cultural movement known as Celtic revivalism, which sought to celebrate and rediscover the distinct cultural traditions of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall. However, historians still debate the true extent of Stukely's influence versus the broader intellectual currents of the time. Was he merely a product of his era, articulating ideas already circulating, or did his specific interpretations genuinely shape the direction of Druidic studies and popular imagina? It's likely a complex interplay, where his detailed work provided the concrete imagery and narrative framework that resonated with the prevailing intellectual and nationalistic sentiments. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the Enlightenment's rationalism began to yield to the emotional intensity and aesthetic sensibilities of the Romantic movement. This shift further amplified the idealized image of the Druids. Romantics, with their reverence for nature, the sublime, and the mysterious, found in the Druids the perfect embodiment of their ideals. The ancient groves, the mist-shrouded stones, the solitary figures communing with nature. These images resonated deeply with the Romantic sensibility. Poets, artists, and writers embraced the Druid as a symbol of primeval wisdom, ecological harmony, and a spiritual connection to the land. One of the most significant, and perhaps most curious, developments of this period was the emergence of modern Druidry. In 1717, a group of Freemasons and antiquarians in London established the Ancient Druid Order, a fraternal organization that claimed a direct, if largely imagined, lineage from the ancient Druids. This was followed by numerous other groups, such as the United Ancient Order of Druids, founded in 1781. These societies, often meeting in taverns or private homes, adopted rituals and symbols that they believed or wished to believe were derived from ancient Druidic practices. They were not, it must be emphasized, direct descendants of the historical Druids, but rather a product of the Romantic imagination, blending elements of Freemasonry, classical scholarship, and a deep yearning for a connection to an idealized past. These early modern Druid orders were less about religious practice and more about social fellowship, mutual aid, and the celebration of ancient British heritage. They often engaged in charitable work, held elaborate ceremonies, and promoted a sense of brotherhood among their members. Their regalia, often featuring white robes, oak leaves, and crescent moons, drew heavily from the popular imagery cultivated by Stukely and other antiquarians. The Romantic allure of the Druid, the wise elder of the forest, offered a compelling identity for these groups, allowing them to tap into a sense of ancient tradition and mystique. The Welsh cultural revival, known as the Eisteddfod movement, also played a crucial role in shaping the modern image of the Druid. In 1792, Iolo Morganwg, Edward Williams, a Welsh poet and antiquarian, organised a gathering on Primrose Hill in London, which he proclaimed to be a revival of an ancient Druidic gorsedd, or assembly. Morganwg, a figure of immense creativity and, it must be said, considerable fabrication, invented much of the ritual and mythology, associated with this modern Gorsed. He claimed to have discovered ancient Druidic texts and traditions, which he then presented as authentic. While his claims were largely unfounded, his efforts profoundly influenced the development of the modern Eisteddfod, where a Gorsed of bards, clad in ceremonial robes, continues to perform rituals and confer honours to this day. Morganwg's work, though historically inaccurate, tapped into a deep longing for a distinct Welsh identity and a connection to a glorious ancient past. He skillfully wove together fragments of genuine Welsh folklore with his own imaginative inventions, creating a compelling narrative that resonated with the Welsh people. His Druids were not just ancient priests, but bards, poets, and guardians of the Welsh language and culture. This fusion of Druidry with bardic tradition became a cornerstone of Welsh national identity and remains a powerful cultural force. The Romantic era also saw the Druids appear frequently in literature and art. William Blake, for instance, incorporated Druidic imagery into his complex mythological system, seeing them as ancient prophets and guardians of primal wisdom. Artists depicted Druids in dramatic landscapes, often under stormy skies or bathed in moonlight, emphasizing their connection to the wild, untamed forces of nature. The idea of the Druid as a solitary figure, communing with the spirits of the earth and sky, became a powerful artistic motif. It is perhaps ironic that a figure like Iolo Morganwg, who essentially invented a significant portion of modern Druidic tradition, is now seen as a pivotal, if controversial, figure in the story of the Druids. His motivations were complex: a genuine love for Welsh culture, a desire to elevate its status, and perhaps a touch of the showman. His legacy highlights a crucial aspect of the Druid revival. It was less about rediscovering an accurate historical past and more about constructing a meaningful one for the present. The Druids became a canvas onto which various ideals, nationalism, spiritual yearning, environmentalism, and a romanticized view of nature could be projected. The 19th century also witnessed the rise of academic archaeology, which slowly began to challenge the more fanciful theories of Stukely and Morganwg. As scientific methods improved and more evidence was unearthed, the direct attribution of Stonehenge to the Druids began to be questioned. Scholars realized that the megalithic monuments predated the known period of Druidic activity by thousands of years. This realization, however, did not diminish the popular appeal of the Druids. Instead, it subtly shifted their image. While they might not have built Stonehenge, they were still seen as ancient, wise, and deeply connected to the land. By the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the image of the Druid had become firmly entrenched in the popular imagination. They were figures of mystery, wisdom, and an idealized connection to nature. This image, born of scholarly speculation, artistic idealization, and a dash of outright invention, would continue to evolve, adapting to new cultural currents and spiritual quests. The Druids, once a shadowy presence in classical texts, had been reborn not as historical figures, but as powerful symbols, capable of embodying a wide range of human aspirations and anxieties. Their journey from ancient priests to modern icons is a testament to the enduring human need for myth, meaning, and a connection to a deeper, more primal past. Perhaps these reimagined Druids, standing silently in the moonlight of countless paintings and poems, whispered stories not just of ancient Britain, but of the very human desire to find wisdom in the wild and meaning in the stones. As the world spun into the 18th and 19th centuries, a new kind of curiosity began to stir, a yearning for the echoes of a lost past that resonated deeply within the emerging Romantic imagination. The ancient Druids, once demonized, then largely forgotten, now began to capture the minds of poets, scholars, and spiritual seekers. This era, marked by a fascination with antiquity and a burgeoning sense of national identity in many European countries, saw the first tentative steps towards what we now call modern Druidry. It wasn't a direct lineage, a secret society passing down rites through generations, but rather a reconstruction, an imaginative reinterpretation born from academic study, poetic fancy, and a deep longing for a spiritual connection to nature. The earliest stirrings of this revival were often intertwined with Freemasonry, an organization itself steeped in esoteric symbolism and ancient-sounding rituals. One of the most significant figures in this nascent movement was John Toland, an Irish philosopher who, in 1726, founded the ancient Druid order. Toland, a deist, saw in the Druids not primitive barbarians, but enlightened philosophers who worshipped a single, universal deity and revered nature as its temple. He imagined them as proponents of liberty and natural law, a vision that appealed greatly to the intellectual currents of his time. His work, A Critical History of the Celtic Religion and Learning, though speculative, laid some of the foundational ideas for later Druid revivals. Another pivotal figure emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Iolo Morganwg, born Edward Williams, a Welsh stonemason, poet, and literary forger, Morganwg possessed an extraordinary imagination and an ardent desire to elevate Welsh culture and language. He claimed to have inherited ancient Druidic traditions from a lineage of bards in his native Glamorgan, presenting elaborate rituals, ceremonies, and a complex theological system he attributed to these ancient Druids. He organized the first recorded Gorsedd of Bards, a gathering of poets and musicians, on Primrose Hill in London in 1792, a public performance that sought to revive what he presented as authentic Druidic practices. Morganwg's influence cannot be overstated, yet it is also a source of enduring scholarly debate. Historians now widely agree that much of what Morganwg presented as ancient Druidic lore was in fact his own ingenious invention. His discoveries of ancient texts and his accounts of an unbroken lineage of Welsh Druids have been largely debunked as forgeries. This revelation, however, doesn't diminish his impact. He created a compelling narrative, a rich tapestry of symbolism and ritual that resonated deeply with the romantic spirit of his age and provided a powerful foundation for the modern Druid movement. The Gorsedd of Bards, for instance, continues to be a central feature of the Welsh Eisteddfod, a major cultural festival, albeit now understood as a 19th century creation rather than an ancient survival. The early Druid orders, often meeting in taverns or private homes, adopted symbols like the oak, the mistletoe, and the crescent moon, drawing inspiration from classical accounts and their own creative interpretations. They were often more social clubs or philosophical societies than religious organizations in the modern sense. Their rituals frequently involved robes, odes to nature, and discussions of morality and wisdom. They sought to connect with a perceived golden age, a time when humanity lived in harmony with the natural world and possessed profound spiritual insight. As the 19th century progressed, the interest in Druidry broadened, influenced by the burgeoning field of archaeology, which began to uncover megalithic sites like Stonehenge and Avebury, sparking renewed wonder about their builders and their possible connection to the Druids. Though archaeological evidence rarely linked these sites directly to the historical Druids, many predated them by millennia. The popular imagination often conflated the two, seeing these monumental stones as ancient temples where Druidic rites might have taken place. This romantic association with ancient stone circles became a powerful visual motif for modern Druidry. The turn of the 20th century saw a diversification of Druidic groups. Some maintained a more fraternal, philosophical focus, while others began to develop explicitly religious dimensions, embracing polytheistic deities, ancestor veneration, and a more structured form of nature worship. The influence of the nascent neo-pagan movement, which sought to revive pre-Christian European spiritual traditions, also began to shape modern Druidry. Figures like Gerald Gardner, often credited with founding modern Wicca, were themselves influenced by Druidic ideas, and some early Wiccan groups even used the term Druid in their names. One of the most significant developments in the 20th century was the increasing emphasis on ecological awareness. As industrialization advanced and environmental concerns grew, modern Druidry found a powerful contemporary resonance. The ancient Druids, as depicted in classical texts, were often portrayed as deeply connected to the forests and natural world, serving as guardians of sacred groves. This image aligned perfectly with a growing desire to protect the environment and foster a more sustainable way of living. Many modern Druid orders today place ecological activism and a profound reverence for the earth at the very core of their spiritual practice. They see themselves as stewards of the land, advocating for environmental protection, participating in tree planting initiatives, and promoting a conscious connection to the cycles of nature. Modern Druidry is not a monolithic religion. It is a diverse and evolving spiritual path. There are numerous orders and traditions, each with its own emphasis and practices. Some, like the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, OBOD, founded in 1964, offer structured correspondence courses that guide individuals through a progressive path of study and practice, often incorporating elements of Celtic mythology, poetry, and meditation. Others are more loosely organized, focusing on communal gatherings and seasonal celebrations. The core tenets, however, often revolve around a few shared principles: reverence for nature, the interconnectedness of all life, the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge, and a deep respect for the ancestors and the spiritual heritage of the land. Many modern Druids observe the Wheel of the Year, a cycle of 8 seasonal festivals such as Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh that mark the solstices, equinoxes, and the midpoints between them. These festivals are seen as opportunities to connect with the rhythms of the earth, to honor the changing seasons, and to celebrate the fertility and abundance of life. The practice of modern Druidry often involves spending time in nature, whether in forests, by rivers, or within stone circles. Meditation, ritual, storytelling, and the creation of art are also common practices. Some Druids engage in tree language, attempting to understand and communicate with the spirits of trees, while others focus on divination, seeking guidance through natural signs and symbols. The emphasis is often on personal experience and intuition, encouraging individuals to develop their own unique relationship with the divine and the natural world. One lesser-known aspect of modern Druidry is its deep engagement with the concept of awen, a Welsh and Cornish word often translated as flowing spirit or divine inspiration. For many Druids, Awen is the animating force of creativity, wisdom, and poetic insight, believed to flow from the divine into the natural world and into human consciousness. It is sought through meditation, artistic expression, and connection with nature, and is often invoked in rituals and ceremonies. This concept highlights the strong emphasis on artistic and poetic expression within many Druidic paths, echoing the ancient bards who were said to be inspired by divine muse. The question of authenticity remains a recurring theme in discussions about modern Druidry. Given the scarcity of reliable historical information about the ancient Druids and the acknowledged fabrications of figures like Iolo Morganwg, how authentic can a modern reconstruction truly be? This is a scholarly dispute that continues to animate discussions within and outside the Druid community. Some argue that true authenticity lies not in a direct, unbroken lineage, which is impossible to prove, but in the spirit of the practice, in the reverence for nature, the pursuit of wisdom, and the ethical principles that align with what little we know of the ancient Druids. Others emphasize that modern Druidry is a contemporary spiritual path, inspired by the past but not bound by it, free to evolve and adapt to the needs of the present. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of modern Druidry is its adaptability and its ability to speak to the spiritual hunger of our times. In a world increasingly disconnected from the natural environment and grappling with ecological crises, the Druidic emphasis on deep connection to the earth, respect for all life, and the sacredness of nature offers a powerful alternative worldview. It provides a framework for understanding humanity's place within the larger web of life, not as masters of nature, but as integral parts of it. The journey of modern Druidry, from the romantic musings of 18th century scholars to the diverse spiritual paths of today, is a testament to the enduring power of the human imagination and our deep-seated need for meaning and connection. It is a story of reconstruction, reinterpretation, and a continuous striving to understand and honor the wisdom that might have been whispered among the ancient oaks long ago. As the sun sets on another day, casting long shadows across ancient stones, one can almost hear the faint echoes of bards, old and new, singing praises to the earth, the sky, and the enduring spirit of Awen. The echoes of the Druids, though faint and often distorted by the mists of time, have never truly faded from the human imagination. Their legacy, a complex tapestry woven from fragmented historical accounts, archaeological discoveries, and centuries of artistic interpretation, continues to captivate and inspire. Even as the Roman Empire reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Western Europe, the memory of these enigmatic figures persisted, evolving with each passing era. In the early medieval period, as Christianity took root across the former Roman provinces, the Druids were often recast through a new lens. Monastic scribes, seeking to contextualize the pre-Christian past, sometimes portrayed them as pagan priests, figures of a bygone era whose spiritual power was now supplanted by the Christian God. Yet, even within these Christian narratives, a certain respect, or perhaps a lingering awe, for their wisdom and connection to nature occasionally shone through. Irish monastic texts, in particular, occasionally depict Druids as powerful sorcerers or advisors to kings, their prophecies and magical abilities acknowledged, even as they were ultimately overcome by Christian saints. For instance, in the hagiographies of St. Patrick, Druids are often presented as formidable opponents, whose magic is ultimately no match for the divine power of the Christian faith. Yet their very presence underscores their perceived importance in the pre-Christian spiritual landscape. As the centuries progressed, and particularly with the advent of the Renaissance and its renewed interest in classical antiquity, the Druids began to re-emerge in a different light. Scholars and antiquarians, poring over the works of Caesar and other classical authors, sought to reconstruct a more authentic image of these ancient priests. This period saw the first serious attempts to connect archaeological sites like Stonehenge with Druidic practices, a connection that, while now largely disputed by modern archaeology, nevertheless cemented their image as monumental builders and celestial observers in the popular consciousness. The 17th and 18th centuries in particular witnessed a burgeoning fascination with all things Celtic and ancient British. Writers and artists, fueled by a romantic yearning for a pristine, pre-industrial past, began to portray Druids as noble savages, wise philosophers, and guardians of ancient wisdom. This romanticized view often projected contemporary ideals onto the distant past, seeing in the Druids a reflection of Enlightenment values such as reason, natural law, and an uncorrupted connection to the earth. One of the most influential figures in shaping this romantic image was William Stukeley, an English antiquarian and clergyman. In the early 18th century, Stukeley, a fervent admirer of Stonehenge and Avebury, became convinced that these megalithic structures were Druidic temples. He published elaborate engravings and theories, depicting Druids in flowing robes performing rituals amidst the ancient stones, often attributing to them a sophisticated astronomical knowledge and a monotheistic belief system. While Stukeley's interpretations were highly speculative and largely unfounded by archaeological evidence, his vivid imagery and passionate writings profoundly influenced subsequent generations. His work helped to firmly embed the image of the Druids as the architects and priests of Stonehenge in the public imagination. A notion that persists even today, despite scholarly consensus that the construction of Stonehenge predates the earliest evidence of Druidic activity by at least a millennium. The 18th and 19th centuries also saw the rise of various neo-Druidic movements. These groups, often inspired by Stukeley's romantic vision and a broader cultural interest in ancient British heritage, sought to revive or reconstruct Druidic traditions. These modern Druids, however, were largely drawing upon a blend of classical accounts, medieval folklore, and contemporary spiritual beliefs, rather than a direct, unbroken lineage of practice. Early neo-Druidic orders, such as the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in 1781, were often more akin to fraternal organizations or benevolent societies, emphasizing moral rectitude, communal harmony, and a reverence for nature. They adopted elaborate rituals and regalia, often inspired by Masonic traditions, and their ceremonies frequently took place at ancient sites or in natural settings. These movements, while not direct descendants of the Iron Age Druids, played a significant role in keeping the concept of Druidism alive and adapting it to modern spiritual and cultural needs. The enduring mystery surrounding the Druids has also fueled countless scholarly debates. One persistent area of contention revolves around the extent of their political power. While Caesar portrays them as highly influential figures, acting as judges, educators, and advisors to kings, some historians argue that his accounts might have exaggerated their authority to present a more formidable enemy to Rome. Was their power truly pan-Celtic? Or was it more localized, varying significantly from one tribe or region to another. The lack of indigenous written records from the Druids themselves means that much of our understanding is filtered through the perspectives of external observers, who often had their own biases and agendas. This scholarly dispute highlights the inherent challenges of reconstructing the history of a non-literate society through the eyes of its conquerors. Another fascinating and still unresolved question concerns the precise nature of their religious beliefs and practices. While classical authors mention human sacrifice and a reverence for natural forces, the details remain tantalizingly vague. Were their rituals elaborate and highly formalized, or more spontaneous and adapted to local circumstances? The archaeological record offers tantalizing clues, such as the discovery of bog bodies like Lindoman, which bear evidence of violent deaths and ritualistic deposition, perhaps hinting at sacrificial practices. However, directly linking these finds to Druidic rituals remains a complex and often speculative endeavor. The absence of a Druidic Bible or detailed theological texts leaves a vast interpretive space, allowing for a wide range of theories, from sophisticated philosophical systems akin to those of the Greeks, to more animistic and shamanistic practices deeply rooted in the natural world. The Druids' connection to nature remains one of their most enduring and appealing characteristics in the modern imagination. Their association with sacred groves, ancient trees, and natural springs has resonated deeply with contemporary environmental movements and spiritual practices that emphasize a profound connection to the earth. This image, cultivated over centuries, portrays them as early ecologists, guardians of the wild, and proponents of a harmonious relationship between humanity and the natural world. While the historical evidence for this specific role is sparse, the idea itself speaks to a deep-seated human desire for a spiritual connection to the environment, a longing for a time when humanity lived in closer communion with the rhythms of nature. In popular culture, the Druids have found a permanent home. From fantasy literature and role-playing games to films and television series, they appear as powerful magic users, wise mentors, or enigmatic figures guarding ancient secrets. Authors like J.R.R. Tolkien, though not explicitly featuring Druids, drew inspiration from Celtic mythology and the idea of ancient, nature-connected wisdom when crafting characters like Gandalf or the elves. The enduring appeal of the Druid archetype lies in its versatility. They can be portrayed as benevolent healers, fierce warriors, or mysterious seers, adapting to various narrative needs, while always retaining an aura of ancient power and connection. On to the mystical. The modern quest to understand the Druids continues unabated. Each new archaeological discovery, each re-evaluation of classical texts adds another piece to the intricate puzzle. While a complete and definitive picture may forever elude us, the ongoing scholarly and popular engagement with their legacy speaks volumes about their profound impact. They represent a powerful symbol of an ancient European past, a time before the widespread dominance of Abrahamic religions, when the spiritual landscape was deeply intertwined with the natural world. The Druids stand as a reminder of the rich tapestry of human belief and practice, a testament to the diverse ways in which different cultures have sought to understand their place in the cosmos. Their story, as it unfolds across millennia, is not just about a group of ancient priests. It is a story about the human need for meaning, for connection to something larger than oneself, and for understanding the mysteries of life and death. The Druids, in their historical ambiguity and enduring cultural resonance, continue to invite us to wonder, to question, and to explore the hidden depths of our own past and the enduring power of myth and memory. Their legacy, like the ancient forests they once revered, continues to grow and evolve, whispering stories across the ages, inviting us to listen closely to the rustling leaves of history.